Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. Your inbox right away. I hope you enjoy these resources and find them helpful in supporting you and your running. And now let's get into today's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast. I am very excited to have you here today tuning in. And we are here today to answer one very simple question, which I think is a great question. Why is intra-run fuel in grams per hour versus grams per kilo of our body weight? And this is a question that I get asked fairly regularly. And it's something that I think is definitely worth kind of breaking down and discussing, because you maybe have wondered this as well. So we are going to dive a little bit deeper into where these intra-run fuel guidelines and recommendations sort of come from. What are the sort of limiting factors or parameters that sort of lead us to have these recommendations? And then, what should we do as runners if we maybe aren't hitting these targets and want to understand how we can get in a little bit more intra-run fuel to reach these goals? I will say before we get started that I have an episode actually in this same season 2 of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where we've done a deep dive on intra-run fueling. It's actually season 2, episode 3. So I highly recommend you check that out. You can go give it a listen either before you listen to this episode. You can hit pause and go back, or you can listen to this first and then go back and listen to that deeper dive on intra-run fueling. In that one, I talk a little bit more about, different fueling options and talk about like what you can use and why you might use different things and what you need for intra-run fuel. Today, we're going to just answer this question a little bit more specifically and keep it a little bit more brief. So most things in nutrition, I would say, the vast majority of things in nutrition are based on grams per kilogram of your body weight, or they use some sort of weight-based body size calculation as a factor. And if you have done any kind of like looking at your macros or looking at your energy requirements or done any carb loading, things of that nature, then you would have come across a lot of these calculations along the way. So macronutrient requirements, carbs, fat, protein, calorie needs, carb loading, grams of carbs per kilo of our body weight. Why is intra-run fuel different? What's different about our intra-run fueling recommendations that we aren't following like a body size or weight calculation? So our recommendations for intra-run fuel are actually based on how long you're going to be running versus your body size. So for example, if you're going to be training, running, etc., for longer than an hour, we ideally want to be taking in 30 grams of carbs per hour. So if we're going to be running for up to 2 hours, we would take in 30 grams of carbs per hour. So per those 2 hours, so 60 grams of carbohydrates in total. But if we're going to be running for between 2 hours and 3 hours, we actually ideally want to be consuming 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So that'll be 60, 60, and 60. So for up to those 3 hours. If we're going to be training or racing for longer than 3 hours, then we actually want to be getting in 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So again, that's going to be 90, 90, 90, 90 for each of those hours that we are running. Now, of course, and I cover this, as I said, in that deeper dive on intra-run fuel. Once we get over that 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, then we also want to making sure that we're getting in multiple different carbohydrate sources. And that is really what it comes down to. Like that's part of the reason why we use an hourly based recommendation versus a weight based recommendation, is because at the end of the day, body size is actually not the limiting factor. Body size does not really play a role in how much carbohydrate can be like consumed and sort of used by the body during exercise. And the limiting factor here is how much carbohydrate we can actually absorb through the GI tract, the digestive tract, which we often refer to as the gut. So if you ever hear us talking about like the gut, what's happening with your gut, do you have gut issues, gut training, all of these different terms, what we mean here is the digestive tract, the digestive system. So body size is not the thing that dictates how much carbohydrate we can consume per hour. I mean, how much logistically you can like get in your mouth per hour. I mean, that's just going to depend on who you are, what you're taking in, how often you're taking in fuel. But when we're looking at like how much carbohydrate can we absorb through the digestive tract, this is not highly variable from person to person based on weight and body size. There probably is some variation like body size wise, just because like a significantly larger person would, theoretically have a larger digestive system than somebody who's much smaller. But like as far as human beings go, there's not that much variation, like not as much as you would maybe think. However, the amount of carbohydrate that we can consume and use and absorb is highly variable depending on the level of gut training that someone has done. So I'll explain that a little bit. Studies that have looked at, how much carbohydrate per hour someone can consume, what's sort of that upper threshold for optimizing performance. Studies that show that there's a lower threshold often don't have this gut training as a component of that study design. So for example, they'll say, and I'm completely just making up a number here. This is not a specific research study that I'm pointing to. But for example, let's say that a research study found that the participants in that research study could consume a maximum of 43 grams of carbohydrates per hour before they were beginning to encounter GI issues. They couldn't tolerate any more than that before they started having stomach issues. These studies generally do not have any gut training done prior to actually doing that study. So they haven't had these athletes undergo, some period of time of actually improving and increasing and working on getting up their tolerance to taking in intra-run fuel, intra-run carbohydrates before they just go and do the study, and then they find that number is lower. So on the other hand, studies that include gut training prior to doing the test actually show significantly higher tolerance to intra-run fuel. And it's very interesting to the point where the benefits have actually been shown to extend into improving post-exercise recovery rather than just optimizing the performance for like during that workout. And so some of the research that's looked at very high carbohydrate intakes, looking at like upwards of 120 grams per hour, it's not so much that there's this continual performance benefit to be gained by taking in more carbohydrates, but in fact, we actually see this translation into maybe more rapid exercise recovery, which for a lot of us, like most of us recreational runners, this probably isn't a huge factor. We have enough time, enough downtime, recovery time, et cetera, in between our workouts to replenish muscle glycogen, to, get those recovery processes that we need to do done, et cetera. But if you're maybe an ultra runner, a triathlete, someone who's doing several workouts a day on a consistent basis, whether it's back-to-back runs, or maybe you're doing different activities like triathletes, et cetera, and you actually need to enhance your recovery as much as you possibly can, as fast as you possibly can, then this is something to maybe think about, that actually taking in more carbohydrate during exercise can sort of start, improving that recovery before you've even really finished that first workout. So very, very interesting. But we don't see this sort of continual improvement in performance, like just forever and ever and ever. So back to, talking about gut training. What exactly is gut training? Because I mentioned it a couple of times here that, how much gut training someone has done, highly variable. Studies maybe include or don't include a component of gut training before actually going through the study itself. Therefore, that definitely can and will impact some of the results that we see coming out of the research. Gut training is actually really simple. Like, it sounds like it might be sort of a complicated thing, but it isn't. It's basically you're practicing your race day fueling strategy. And over time, this is going to be like for sure weeks, probably even months, especially if you have never done anything like this before. You are going to be practicing your race day fueling strategy and slowly increasing the amount of carbohydrate you are taking in per hour. So you are starting very small and starting very slow. So you are not starting at 90 grams of carbs per hour. Absolutely not. You are not starting at 90 grams of carbs per hour. We're starting at like, 5, 10, maybe 15 grams of carbs per hour, depending on how sensitive you are. I mean, for some people, even the thought of taking in any food or fluid, and something like that during a run just gives them the ick immediately. But for other people, they could drink a sports drink, they could take the odd gel here and there. It's just we need to kind of dial that up and get them to at least hitting that 30 grams of carbs per hour. Honestly, I would say the majority of runners that I encounter, that I work with on gut training, usually people can do pretty good with hitting about 30, maybe 25 to 30 grams of carbs per hour. Most people need to essentially double the amount of fuel that they're taking in. So that's going to take some practice. That's going to take a little bit of time. As I said, it's going to be weeks to months. But if you're going to be running races that are going to be longer than about that 90-minute, 2-hour mark, this is a really, really good idea because you only have so much carbohydrate that you can store as muscle glycogen. And if you are going to be burning through that, even with a great carbohydrate loading strategy, and you want to really perform your best, you don't want to struggle in the last few miles of your races, then taking in and being able to consume carbohydrate during your training runs, during your race, etc., is going to ultimately just improve and enhance your performance. So the key takeaway here is that, this intra-run fuel, we don't need to worry about body size or weight or anything like that. We are really looking at gut training as the main modifier of how much intra-run fuel we are able to take in, and to be looking at how long we're going to be running for, what is that race distance, and the duration of time we're going to be running as the main thing that dictates what our goal carbohydrates per hour are going to be. So if you are someone who really struggles with eating or drinking before your runs, the first thing that you really want to think about is starting to train your gut to tolerate more food and fluid before and during your runs. But don't get overwhelmed by the numbers that I'm sharing here today. I want you to start really small and I want you to go slow. We're talking a sip of water. We're talking a bite of a banana. We're talking half a piece of toast before you run. We're talking about an energy chew. We're talking, half a gel, an hour. Like start small, go slow, and give yourself plenty of time to be practicing these things and figure out what works for you. Ideally, if you're following a 12 to 16 week race program for, say, a marathon or half marathon, realistically, as soon as you start that training plan is when you should start your gut training. So please do not wait until you have 4 weeks or 3 weeks until race day. Half of that is your taper, and all of a sudden you decide you want to start doing something about your fueling and figuring it out. It's just too late at that point to really make that much of a difference. You don't have enough time to test things. You don't have enough time to gut train, and you maybe are even going to have a worse performance on race day, digestively speaking, by trying a bunch of stuff that you didn't really have time to figure out beforehand. And I'll also say that anything that you can get in is better than nothing. So even if you are going to be running for longer than 3 hours, but you don't reach 90 grams of carbs per hour, that is okay. It can start to get really difficult, logistically speaking, especially if you're one of the vast, vast, vast majority of us runners who are not elite runners. We don't have a team of people supporting us during practices and during races. We don't have someone standing there holding our bottles, riding a bike alongside us, making sure that we take in all of our fuel. We don't have a dedicated table of stuff for us to grab as we run by. We just don't have the same support that, the elite runners do. And so if you need to bring and carry all of those gels or all of that sports drink or all of that fuel along with you, it can start to get a little bit cumbersome. And again, logistically, at 90 grams of carbs per hour, depending on what you're using for fueling, you will feel like you do not stop eating and drinking that entire race, which, isn't unreasonable. It's not wrong or bad if you are reaching that 90 grams of carbs per hour and you do feel like you never stop eating and drinking that entire race. But if 30 grams of carbs is good, 60 grams of carbs is better, but 30 grams of carbs is still something. It's still going to get you in a better position by saying, oh, you know what, Steph, there's no way I can reach 90 grams of carbs per hour. I don't have enough time, or, I just can't carry all that stuff with me. I just don't want to do it. So I'm just going to do nothing. I would love for you to get something in, even if it's not quote unquote perfect, because what is perfect anyway? That doesn't exist. Try different things to see what works for you. Maybe you like gels, maybe you don't. Maybe you like sports drink, maybe you don't. Maybe you like to use chews or whole foods. It doesn't even need to be things that are necessarily sweet. There's definitely lots of non-sweet options out there that can still get you to your carbohydrate goals. So, don't get overwhelmed or bummed out by what other people are doing and feeling like that won't work for you, therefore nothing will work. There's always an option. There's always something that can be done. If you need help with this, if you've listened to this episode and you're like, okay, yes, I definitely understand that intra-run fueling is important. I'm be running for, longer than 2 or 3 hours. I want to perform my best, but I still don't really know where to start. I still don't really understand how this all works. Then I would love to help you out. And that's exactly what I do here at Stephanie Natchuk Performance Nutrition. I have lots of different options depending on what level of support and guidance you're looking for, whether it's one-on-one coaching with me. I offer both nutrition and run coaching. I have my online program, which is the Fuel Train Recover Club, which gives you access to all of my nutrition resources, training plans that I've created for every level of runner. We've got, literally your intro to 5K, learning how to run, running your very first race, all the way up to training for your marathon for the more experienced runners. And then if you're looking for just, a quick nutrition tune-up, if you just need a little bit of help nailing down some numbers, figuring out your macronutrient requirements, understanding, the timing of your meals, how to eat in a training phase versus your off season, et cetera, and you just kind of need that info and, want to run with it, then I also have an online course for runners, my Fuel for Runners course, which is a great option if you're just looking for that little nutrition tune-up. So I've got lots of different options, lots of different ways that we can work together, ways that I can help you get ready to really crush it and conquer the next race that you're in. That is it for today. So I hope that this answered your question of why is intra-run fuel in grams per hour versus by weight. Once again, don't forget to check out episode 3, season 2, on a much deeper dive into intra-run fueling requirements. And that is it for today. I will catch you back here next week. Oh yeah, if you want to learn more about all the ways that we can work together, I guess I should tell you this. If you want more information on all of that, then all of the links are in the show notes, or you can visit www.stephanienatchuk.com. All right. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you back here next week. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.